Hello there.
Ha, word.
Before we get started, I wanted to apologize for not having my face in this video, but a lot of the recording equipment I needed to make that format have decent quality is in my lab, and given the state of the world right now, I'm gonna have to make the best of what I have here, because I can't really go back. Before we get started talking about Rian Johnson and The Last Jedi, I wanted to ask that you all don't get into keyboard wars with each other in the comments. You guys were wonderful in my last comments section, and with only one bad egg out of 35 comments, I'd say that's considerably less death threats than I was expecting. But nevertheless, remember to be civil in the comments section. With housekeeping out of the way, this video essay is going to be very similar to the last. For those who are new, my name is Thomas, and I'm pretty much what you would think about when you think of a stereotypical nerd. I study physics in university and even own an Ultra Saber. If you haven't seen my video on why The Force Awakens is great, I would refer you to that one for background arguments that I'll be referencing in this video. First, I'm going to talk about Rian Johnson, his filmography, and why I believe he's a very talented filmmaker who people need to stop calling a hack and a cinematic fraud. Then, while discussing The Last Jedi, we're going to marinate on the story arc between Luke, Rey, Snoke, and Kylo Ren, as I believe it's some of the best Star Wars content in the entire franchise. Then, we're going to talk about the copious, and there's a lot of them, the copious problems that this film has, and why it's nowhere near as good as it could have been. I'll concede that there were a lot of problems with the B-plots, and don't worry, we'll address them in time, so don't think that this is a vapid, one-dimensional defense. Sure, I could have titled the video, The Last Jedi is a decent enough movie with problematic B-plots and a monopolistic development process where nobody questioned Rian's story choices that hindered potential, resulting in a permanently fractured fanbase, but that wouldn't get as many clicks, now would it? I know that enough people have made a video essay on The Last Jedi to account for the entire population of Canada, so I'm really going to try my best here to not retread common themes. We're also going to mention the overreactions to this movie on both sides of the favorability equation, and to make up for the fact that you can't see my face, I'll try and keep you engaged with my mediocre humor and stellar golf skills. So, with that being said, let's defend The Last Jedi and see how good the film really is.
Put all sections on alert.
Obi-Wan is here. The Force is with him.
If you're right, he must not be allowed to escape.
Rian, or is it Ryan? I don't know. I'll probably switch between calling him both throughout this entire video, but Rian Johnson is one of the best directors in Hollywood. His ability as a writer is admittedly very questionable and shaky, and we'll discuss that later, but as a cinematographer and director, he's nearly unmatched, and is possibly the best director the Star Wars franchise has ever had. This film is absolutely beautiful, and I don't think I've ever seen someone say it isn't. Its visuals, special effects, framing, acting, and camera work, they're all beyond reproach. Now, I won't deny that Rian is terrible at directing action in this movie. Right off the bat, the massive throne room fight is a huge mess, and if you go into the theater looking for special effects porn, you're going to understandably be very disappointed at all lightsaber-related aspects of this movie. However, having a lackluster lightsaber fight isn't the worst thing in the world if the rest of your movie relies on underlying character relations and conflicts. I'd refer you to the lightsaber fight in A New Hope if you don't believe me, and if that isn't enough proof for you, I'd refer you to Christopher Nolan's Batman movies. Nobody watched the movie for this.
Familiar, don't you have anything new? How about this?
They watched the movie for this.
But what I do, that defines me.
Bruce?
Like I said, the writing of this film had a lot of issues that we're going to talk about later, but for now, just know that I think he did a great job directing. Now, to those who make a living trashing this movie on YouTube, I've heard the man called Rian Johnson a childhood rapist, a hack, a liberal SJW maniac who wants to wipe white people out of movies, a crazed lunatic, you name it. I've heard all of them. Hear me out. This dude has a lot of issues, but I disagree completely with these prior notions, and I wanted to talk about his filmography for a little bit. His recent work involved writing and directing Knives Out, an excellent whodunit murder mystery story, as well as directing the thriller Looper, as well as writing and directing the cult classic movie Brick, all of which are great in their own rights. However, his most prolific work was within the show Breaking Bad, as he directed 3 of some of the best episodes of the show in its entire run. He directed Fly, 51, Ozymandias, and I'd like to focus in on his accomplishments on Ozymandias if you allow me to go on a tangent for a bit, despite how the other two episodes are excellent in their own right. If I had to tell you why a show like Breaking Bad is still the best show ever made and a show like Game of Thrones has been pretty much kicked to the wayside, it would be all about how a show can stick its landing. Sure, Rian didn't write Ozymandias, but he sure as hell played 100% of a part in why that show is the masterpiece it's heralded as today. For reference, we're gonna spoil the hell out of that show, so if you care about spoilers for Breaking Bad, please skip to the timestamp above. Ozymandias to this day has a 100% on IMDb and is largely considered one of the best crafted, written, directed, and acted pieces of television ever put to the screen, if not the best. Of course I'm speaking critically, but in terms of audience reception, it's pretty damn similar. The episode chronicles Walter White's fall from grace, the murder of his brother-in-law, his family turning against him, and finally Walt going into hiding. It was the episode that we all knew was coming, but everyone hoped could stick the landing. Rian's camera work and directorial choices, they were brilliant. From the way he framed dialogue between Walt and other characters throughout the episode, or the foreshadowing of the knife during the flashback and the way that it's framed during an altercation between Walt and his family, or the heart-wrenching camera work panning away when Walter abducts Skylar's child. There's so much juicy, pretentious, douchebag camera angle stuff in this episode, and it's subconsciously one of the reasons that the episode worked as well as it did, not to mention his acting coaching. His leadership and determination of what made the cut and what needed to be reshot or even minorly altered is why this episode works as well as it did, in tandem with its writing, of course. It's all deliberate, and to imply that any of it was unintentional would be disingenuous. Ozymandias and Rian Johnson's work on Breaking Bad is why the show cemented itself as one of the very best programs ever made, and Rian Johnson is anything but a hack based off his work on this one show alone, and he could make 100 bad movies after this and it wouldn't change the fact that the man does have talent. Now, am I saying the guy can do no wrong?
No.
Am I saying that the guy is a flawless writer?
No.
Of course not. What I'm saying is that the man is one of the best directors of our time, and I feel like using this movie, good or bad, to derail his entire career and credibility is not the most solid hill to die on. To be frank, it's a disingenuous spin to pretend that even if The Last Jedi is bad, that ruins his entire credibility.
I'll try spinning. That's a good trick.
As a final note on this issue before I drop it and start talking about Star Wars again, to those of you that would say him doing television is different from him doing movies, you'd be right if we were talking about, I don't know, fucking iCarly or, Seinfeld or even a show like Arrow, but Breaking Bad had the budget of and was shot like and acted like any other major blockbuster. The format, if anything, just served to enhance the story and give us more time to marinate in those little details that matter the most. Case in point, Rian Johnson is not a whack job. So with the prologue on Rian Johnson out of the way, we can talk about The Last Jedi, and more specifically, everything that makes it simultaneously the most brilliant and awful movie in the saga.
Because I was Luke Skywalker, Jedi Master.
The reason I would argue this movie is great lies within its primary plot, that being the storyline between Rey, Kylo Ren, Luke, Snoke, and Yoda. All of these characters are used to discuss themes and ideas previously untouched in the Star Wars mythos, and they add this level of maturity to the storytelling and even redeem some of the nonsense elements of the Star Wars prequels. Right off the bat, I'm not even going to try to argue that Rey isn't too powerful. She is, and we don't have enough screen time of her training in this movie. So let's agree she shouldn't have been able to beat Luke to the ground. Luke throwing the lightsaber was jarring for the sake of being jarring, and Snoke probably should have been fleshed out a bit more before dying. While I don't agree with the fact that Rey is a blatant Mary Sue, I can understand why people would make the argument based off this movie alone. Other than that, I literally love everything about this story arc, so enough with the bitching and moaning, and let's talk about why the primary plot in this film is great. To those that would say those plot contrivances I mentioned in this story arc take away from the greater meaning of the film, I would say,
No.
The ability to speak does not make you intelligent.
Luke Skywalker has some of the best scenes in this entire film. We learn that Luke is a hermit and lives in deep depression and solitude, closed off from the Force. Sure, this isn't the Luke Skywalker we knew in the original trilogy, but I would say that just because something didn't turn out the way you wanted to, that doesn't make that thing bad. There's a difference between plot contrivance and plot consistency. And if you think you've heard that before, I would remind you, yeah, I said that a lot in the last video.
It's like poetry, so they rhyme.
Remember how cynical and depressed Yoda was in The Empire Strikes Back? He didn't want to train Luke, lived in exile, and only trained him at the insistence of Obi-Wan Kenobi. The reason we were okay with it in 1980 was because we never knew who Yoda was, and this was a blank slate character as far as we were concerned, and then the prequels came along and justified it and showed us Yoda in his prime. I would extend the same argument for Luke, and the biggest issue I could have with Luke being a hermit is that it feels like this trilogy has a missing movie that would have taken place before The Force Awakens. J.J. Abrams and Kathleen Kennedy were so desperate to do a reboot of A New Hope, they didn't consider the troubling implications it would have on the characters and the lore. In my mind, Rian did the best with the options he was given in terms of story ideas. I mean, guys, let's be real here. We could have seen a Star Wars movie where Dexter Jettster fights fucking Kylo Ren or some shit over Jar Jar's corpse in the Senate Hall. But, you know, we got a decent movie instead. Luke has some conversations with Rey about the dogmatic idiocy of the Jedi and why Darth Sidious rose to power and killed all of them. The best part is, Luke's completely right. He sees how flawed and dogmatic the Jedi were, and his abiding by the old teachings are what caused history to repeat itself. I mean, come on, did you really think that Anakin Skywalker would be the only troubled egg who was failed by a system that never tried to rehabilitate his underlying issues in the first place?
No.
Without this qualifier, the prequels are a plot hole-ridden heap of nonsense, with idiot Vulcan Mormons playing the part of Jedi, and, you know, to quote Red Letter Media, the bad guys are the bad guys just because we're told that the Sith are the bad guys. The Last Jedi went in and corrected a ton of this retrospectively, and legitimized the three-dimensional conflict that was the Jedi and Sith. Sure, in the original trilogy, the Empire was evil and the Rebels were the good guys, and it was very straightforward. But this movie gave the prequels a boost to attain the moral complexity and ambiguity that they were trying so hard to convey. Rian is aware of what came before, and he respects it for what it was. Sure, it may be a fucking Flex Steel slap of a fix to legitimize and elucidate the message of the prequels, but, I mean, shit, it got the job done. Luke's scenes with Rey are very good for what they are, not to mention the masterful scene between Luke and Yoda where Yoda burns down a Jedi temple, after telling that provided people learn from their mistakes, there's no need to dwell on the past. It's one of my favorite moments in Star Wars that transcends the Force into real-life wisdom. I'll just play the clip for you.
The greatest teacher failure is. We are what they grow beyond. That is the true burden of all masters.
Let's get something straight. Luke Skywalker never would have killed Ben, despite the framing of the film on that initial viewing, and it's become much clearer to me on every single rewatch. This is the same Luke Skywalker that temporarily lashed out at Vader and tried to murder him. It's the same Luke that attempted to shoot Jabba the Hutt in the face, and yes, it's the same Luke that floated the idea of murdering his nephew to prevent history from repeating itself. This is the same guy. Much like how Luke saw what he was about to do and didn't lay a finger on Ben Solo, he also saw how he was becoming his father and threw away his lightsaber and became a true Jedi. So yes, I don't have a single problem with what Luke Skywalker thought about doing, because Luke has always been very similar to his father Anakin, only that he pulls back at the last minute and makes the right decision. While we're on the idea of Luke and Ben Solo, let's talk about how this movie understands what a Jedi is more than any other Star Wars movie, except for maybe The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. In A New Hope, the Jedi Knights are described as warriors in the Clone Wars who were wise but used the Force as a weapon to defend the innocent, similar to the Knights of medieval fiction. In Empire and Return of the Jedi, we get a more nuanced look, saying that the Jedi should never use the Force to hurt others, rather, only to defend themselves. Even Luke Skywalker doesn't really become a Jedi until he, ironically enough, threw away the weapon that allegedly made him one in Return of the Jedi.
Meanwhile,
the prequels, they couldn't go 5 minutes without whipping out the lightsabers, and if Jedi were truly abiding by the code that they claimed to uphold, they would only use weapons and Force as a last resort. The only Jedi that comes kinda close to satisfying this is Qui-Gon, and even he couldn't go 10 minutes without whipping out the lightsabers. Yoda should not be directing clones into war. In terms of the original 6 films, Yoda and Jedi directing clones into war felt like a spit in the eye compared to what we learned in the original trilogy. However, this film tells us that those Jedi were dogmatic, warlike, and wrong, thus making me like the prequel films a lot more. In his final fight with Kylo, he doesn't ignite a real lightsaber, attack, or even threaten Kylo Ren. I understand that some people wanted to see Luke at the height of his power doing video game shit and jumping off walls and showing us how mighty he became, but once again, just because we didn't get what we wanted, it didn't make it a bad choice. And sure, that rule isn't always going to apply for a lot of choices in this film, but it sure as hell applies for this one. Sure, I didn't particularly need to see Luke drink milk from the teat of a space cow, but in a way, I'm glad it's what we got. A lightsaber may never clash with a lightsaber in this film, but it has a lot more to say meaningfully about the Jedi philosophy and Sith ideology than any film in the saga. I mean, people act like Rian wrote this movie drunk and was unable to form a cogent thought. Instead of using violence to solve his problems, he instead uses the Force to project himself to Crate in the climax and selflessly sacrifices his own life, distracting Ben Solo long enough for the Resistance to escape. His dialogue, movements, and facial expressions, they show Luke in more of a prime than we ever got to see him in, arguably. Him being a hermit, it makes sense in context of the greater saga. His death is beautiful, selfless, and arguably the most Jedi-like action taken in the entire sequel and prequel trilogies combined. Luke Skywalker, by the end of this movie, is more a true Jedi than he's ever been in his life, with the exception of Return of the Jedi, of course. That's without talking about how much I loved his final scene with Leia or seeing Mark Hamill on screen again in general. Well, now that I've defended Luke Skywalker, I might as well just quit now because people really aren't going to like what I have to say about Rey, Kylo, and Snoke at all.
I'd never felt so alone.
You're not alone.
Snoke was crafted by J.J. Abrams to be a retread of the Emperor, and upon realizing that killing Han Solo brought him no closer to the dark side, Kylo realizes that Snoke is just using him as a battering ram against the Resistance, and he didn't care about him. Similar to how Anakin would have killed Chancellor Palpatine and ruled the galaxy along Padme had Obi-Wan not turned him into a ribeye steak, the same logic applies for Kylo Ren. He's not stupid. He knows that Snoke doesn't care about him. The only difference here is that Ben Solo doesn't have the physical handicaps that Anakin did. Snoke needed to die. I'll just come out and say it. If he was alive, the trilogy would have retreaded the original before it, and if you're making a sequel trilogy to such a legendary series of movies, you can't just retread ideas for nostalgia points, and unfortunately we'll talk about that when I bring up Rise of Skywalker in the final video. Snoke was a clear derivative cheat of Palpatine made by J.J. Abrams under duress, and provided they did something interesting with Snoke, it would have been okay. Like we said, The Force Awakens was a brand-reviving movie, so it was okay to be a bit of a plagiarism. Should we have gotten to know Snoke a little better, like where he came from and how he got his hands on the First Order? Yes, of course. Like I said, the prequels marinated in this kind of detail, but the idea of killing him off was brilliant, and it looked like it was going to take the final entry of the trilogy in an unheard-of direction. I blame Rian for not fleshing him out a bit, but Snoke was never meant to be an intriguing character from Rian's perspective, because, let's be real, he was just one of J.J. Abrams' signature mystery box characters. He had no plans for where Rian could take him. He was, and always was, Diet Coke Sheev. After all, I mean, let's be real here, nobody can recapture the evil of Ian McDiarmid. Rey and Kylo Ren having a connection through the Force where they can transfer settings and surroundings to each other, it's a brilliant idea, and it adds a lot of complexity to the idea that the Force has a will and character of its own, to quote Qui-Gon. To those who say that it isn't in the prior movies and that this is a stupid Force power, I really, dude, like, nobody cared when Obi-Wan developed Force speed in the prequels, or when the Emperor shot lightning out of his hands in Return of the Jedi, or that Anakin and Palpatine had a brief but subtle conversation through the Force where he connected them to Padme in Revenge of the Sith. So why the hell would anybody care that this is a thing in the new movies? It's not like Force healing in the next movie, which is blatantly disrespectful and opens up a lot of plot holes. This power is established to be very rare and obscure, and it doesn't really create plot holes in the larger saga. It even scares Luke when he doesn't know what to make of it, because this is like an unheard of and incredibly rare Force power. Their hinted at romantic chemistry is that of a relationship that would never work, and it shouldn't work. The angle that I like is Kylo Ren developing feelings for Rey, but it is so goddamn stupid that they were trying to make Rey fall in love with him. I mean, Han Solo's body isn't even cold. I can't defend that choice. Kylo Ren's hesitance to kill his mother, his refusal to harm Rey, and his conflict between the light and dark side is fleshed out once again in this film, and I love every bit of it. Sure, he lashes out, and, you know, he's no more a leader than I am the president of Paraguay, but once again, if you didn't know that, I'm afraid you've missed the point. Similar to Anakin's characterization, except, you know, done well.
And I slaughtered them like animals.
Ben Solo is meant to be an unlikable, conflicted, torn bastard, and it works very well in this movie. When he fought alongside Rey, talked to her through the Force about how he was harmed by Luke and he's never let anyone in, and finally broke her heart and asked her to join him, I bought every bit of it on Adam Driver's end. The reason this deserves a lot of credit is that this movie ultimately decided to make Ben Solo die and Kylo Ren rise, and it's very clear what direction Rian wanted to take this saga in. What do I mean? Well, after Rey abandons Ben in the throne room, he has nothing to live for. His family is all assumed to be dead except for his mother, who hates him. He still, in his own eyes, he still hates Luke. Nobody sides with him, and he feels like it's too late. His master's dead. I mean, what does he have to live for? He didn't have a Luke Skywalker to tell him that they believe in his inner good nature. He didn't have a Padme to ground him. The only thing that Rey did was say that he could run away with her, but we all know that that was never going to happen. We all know that if Ben Solo ever returned to the Republic, he would have been hanged as a war criminal within a day. Rian was going to make Ben Solo go in his father's footsteps, only this time we weren't going to get a redemption. And it would have been a really poetically tragic way to end the saga in the following film. Let's have a thought experiment for a minute. If Kylo turned fully evil, defied our expectations, and forced Rey and the crew's hand into killing him, it would end the Skywalker lineage, and it would ultimately lead to a better galaxy without their massive bloodline of power harming other people in the future. It was a brilliant choice, and guys, I gotta be honest, I'm pissed that J.J. Abrams walked this back, and the entire sequel to this film feels incredibly disrespectful to the entire saga, but we'll talk about why that movie is offensively mediocre when the time comes. The choice to make Kylo Ren go full evil and bad guy was brilliant, and I'm very angry that it was walked back. Because the vitriolic hatred that this movie received, I'm convinced that's why it happened. It disgusts me when internet audiences rate this movie a 0, 1, and 2 on Metacritic and review bomb the hell out of it. And I'm not once going to claim in this video that The Last Jedi is a 10 out of 10. It's not even in my top half of favorite Star Wars movies. But if the film is a 0, you know, I'd hate to see what the hell you would think Paul Blart Mall Cop 2, Jack and Jill, or Attack of the Clones would be in your book, because this vapid internet hatred is tearing apart the Star Wars community from within itself. I'm really convinced that this fan base is never going to be pleased, because The Force Awakens is an example of a safe movie done well, and this is a risky movie done acceptably, and the fan base hated both of them. Remember, this is the same fan base that belittled George Lucas to the point he said screw you all and sold the rights to Disney in the hopes that somebody could make his fans happy. The toxic minority, and let us be clear, it is a minority. If you don't like this film, I'm not lumping you in with that group. In fact, you're probably not. But that toxic minority of people who are so vocal about this having been SJW trash and ruined the saga, they've convinced me that this group is never going to be pleased. God, I really killed the mood there. I really killed the mood there, didn't I?
Good job.
Rey's parents being nobodies was potentially one of the best decisions that this movie made. I adore that it chose to have a message that your heritage shouldn't define you, and that those that live by the past are doomed to repeat it. Sure, Ben Solo insists multiple times to let the past die. He says the words, sure, but he didn't believe him, and I don't know if you missed this, but Ben is the villain. Like, you're not supposed to. The dude's in the wrong. Sure, it would have been magical to hear that Rey's parents were killed during the Purge, or that she's a bastard child of Obi-Wan Kenobi. But I believe Rian once again understands a very Star Wars-y idea more than most fans are even capable of. I mean, think of it this way. Who were Anakin Skywalker's parents? They were nobodies. He was born a virgin birth without a father to a slave on a planet so destitute it was out of the reaches of the Republic. The Force needed balance, and the Force conceived Anakin, be it through Sith manipulation or not, such that the universe could be corrected. Similarly, Rey is born to nobodies, a vessel for the Force to correct its own balance again. Much like how Anakin didn't let his past as a slave determine if he would take his first steps as a Jedi, to be fair, Rey didn't let her heritage define her in the end either. Sure, they sold her for gambling money, and she comes from nothing, but if the idea of the Force is purely about what line of lineage you're from, you've lost the point of how mystical the Force acts and what it fundamentally represents. If the Force truly is a living character in and of itself with a will, as Qui-Gon Jinn believed, or as Yoda believed in the original trilogy, the will of the Force can manifest, and often will, in the most unlikely of people and the most unlikely of places. It's a beautiful idea, and I was deeply angered when the sequel to this film retconned and walked back this decision because a bunch of vocal angry nerds on the internet who thought it was vapid political messaging and nothing more got pissed off. The great thing about living in America, specifically Philadelphia for me, is that centuries ago, our founding fathers, they gathered down the street from me in a building known as Independence Hall, and they drafted a Constitution and a Bill of Rights and a Declaration of Independence, all of which were to protect the citizens. They fought a bloody war. George Washington crossed the Delaware, Cornwallis surrendered, and the statues of King George III were torn down in all their decadence, all in the name of liberty and justice for all. The best part of this liberty is that the people who think Rian Johnson has zero understanding of Star Wars have the right to their wrong opinion. But, it doesn't stop me from making a stupid, mediocre hot take video. I guess what I'm getting at with Snoke, Rey, Kylo, and Luke stuff is that, while yes, it's very controversial, it doesn't break continuity with the story before it, aside from the dumb Rey falling in love with Kylo Ren thing. The thing that most people don't realize is that Star Wars is and always has been a tragedy in the eyes of George Lucas, and The Last Jedi is a hauntingly respectful idea of that point. The first 6 films are the story of how a man born a slave with vast potential was manipulated by his only parental figure after leaving slavery and serving in a war that he was too young to understand. Upon having personal conflicts and emotional heartbreak, he was failed by the very people that he thought he was able to trust. He lost everything and died protecting the only thing he had left in his life, that being his son. He was trapped in his body for over 20 years in constant pain as a mutilated man, more machine than man. And the only thing he had at the end of his life was finally seeing his son with his own eyes. Much like how Obi-Wan failed Anakin as he burned on the sands of Mustafar, Rey and Luke failed Ben as his soul burned on the ruins of Snoke's starship. The Skywalker lineage is, by design, intrinsically tragic. My only regret with this is that either Anakin or Vader should have played a part in Kylo Ren's inner psyche, but it makes perfect sense why he hates all of it and just wants the world to burn. While I was disappointed that I didn't get a lightsaber fight, I was counting the days until the finale of the trilogy just so I could see Kylo Ren be a devastating villain, the likes of which we hadn't seen since Sidious. Call me a cynical bastard, but I love me a good Greek tragedy. I remember when I saw this movie for the first time, and I didn't really have a reaction. When The Force Awakens ended, I gave it a standing ovation to my crowd opening night. When The Last Jedi premiered, the room was silent, and nobody knew what to think. Sure, it wasn't a crowd pleaser, but it also gave us things we weren't expecting, for better or for worse. So, while the ultimate direction of the saga didn't do what I wanted it to, the primary plot of The Last Jedi is great. It delivers emotional gut punches, great character development, redeemed the prequels by giving them new subtext, and made insightful and meaningful commentary on what separated Anakin from Vader, and why Ben Solo had the potential to be the ultimate tragic figure of the saga. Sure, we knew that in the sequel to this film, Rey would win, but Rian wasn't focusing on the destination, he was focusing on the journey, and it would have been one hell of a journey if we got to see the moral degradation of Ben Solo and the crushing of the Resistance. If the Skywalker lineage were to die off, the galaxy would be safe again.
Be careful not to choke on your aspirations, Director.
I stand by what I love about this movie, but it would be downright dishonest for me to say this movie doesn't have a litany of issues. While I may love the primary story arc, the movie has a ton of issues that I want to go down really quickly and symptomatically. If you don't like the movie over these issues, I completely get it. In fact, I wouldn't blame you. I understand. However, let me be clear, if you're just one of the people that has a problem with the fact Rey is a female Jedi who has power, go fuck yourself. If you have a problem with the fact that Kathleen Kennedy took a picture with the female stars with shirts saying the Force is female, go fuck yourself. If you have a problem with the fact that she was too powerful, that's the first minor thing I will concede, provided you don't blame it on SJW politics or fucking Bernie Sanders or something. Rey's victory in The Force Awakens was fine. In fact, the plot arguably was better for it, but it's important that you have the protagonist have the illusion of being in danger. If Rey effortless dispatches TIE fighters, clones, and fights toe-to-toe with Kylo Ren against the Praetorian Guards, then you've destroyed any and all illusion that Rey's in actual danger. It's a big issue with this film in particular compared to the others in the trilogy. Everything Poe does in this movie is insufferable and pointless. His plot about trying to mutiny against Vice Admiral Holdo is dumb and it doesn't make any sense, and the fact that Holdo and Leia held secrets from him is more of a contrivance than anything. Any growth Poe had in the first movie is completely undone. Holdo's move to destroy the enemy's fleet is very visually stunning, but conceptually stupid, and neither of any of these characters had any character arc to speak of. Additionally, the Finn and Rose story arc is some of the worst content in Star Wars. While I would still rather watch Canto Bight than this crap,
as you see, my Jedi powers are far beyond yours.
That really ain't saying much, clearly. They're poorly developed, they have zero screen chemistry, Rose is way too blunt and ham-fisted with her political messages for a Star Wars movie, despite how much I do genuinely agree with them. The Codebreaker subplot was also nonsensical and a red herring, and Captain Phasma managed to raise her overall saga time to about 44 femtoseconds. Kelly Marie Tran is an amazing woman and actress, and John Boyega is honestly more of a Star Wars fan than any celebrity I've ever heard of, so the blame doesn't go on them. And, you know, saving Space Antelope and jeopardizing the entire mission, it was all nonsense. It distracted from the major plot. I'm not going to dwell on it because we're all in agreement that that stuff sucked. It would be disingenuous to pretend that it was profound and excellent. I also disliked the entire setting of the Battle of Crate because it was so derivative of The Empire Strikes Back that its opening was practically a shot-for-shot remake. Say what you want about the prequels, which I still don't like two of them, at all, but they went out of their way to expand and flesh out the universe, whereas this trilogy seems to rehash what we've already seen without any of the underlying meaning, and while it's not as offensive in this film or in The Force Awakens, it becomes a lot more offensive in this sequel. It's why the final 20 minutes of The Force Awakens was the best content out of the entire sequel trilogy, because it was all original. See the original video for more on that. Leia flying through space, it was stupid and disrespectful, especially given the tragic passing of Carrie Fisher in real life and the fact that they had nothing else to do with her character for the saga. The Canto Bight planet was an insufferable and unimaginative Las Vegas ripoff as well. I don't want to go to Las Vegas. Las Vegas fucking sucks, but even if I did want to go drink too much, gamble, and marry a prostitute, I can hop on the high-speed line and go to Jersey and do it in Camden. I don't want to do it in a galaxy far, far away. In addition, my final major issue with this movie is that it has way too much humor, and it detracts from any suspense or tension that the film is trying to set up in all the B-plots, and pretty often in the A-plot, too. It often contradicts the tone that the fantastic A-plot is trying to establish, and it just is kind of distracting in the B-plots. Similar to going from the death of Qui-Gon to immediately Jar Jar being an idiot, cutting from dramatic scenes to dumb comedic relief, it's very jarring. It's been said before by the creator of Star Wars himself.
I may have gone too far in a few places.
I mean, trust me, I understand that you're trying to integrate humor into Star Wars, and it can be done tastefully. It's not like this is fucking Hamlet. Luke throwing the lightsaber, it wasn't funny, it was jarring. Poe's interaction with Hux at the beginning wasn't funny, it was pandering. I could go on with further interactions like this, but like I said, this is a defense, I'm not going to dwell too much on nitpicks. Now, why did The Last Jedi have all of these copious problems? I believe the answer is surprisingly familiar to the franchise direction as a whole, but I have a feeling that the people who hate this film have already clicked off thinking I would have nothing but blind praise for it, so whatever. Rian Johnson may be a prolific visionary director, but he has much less experience as a writer, and it really shows. He was the sole writer on this project, as well as director, and similar to when Lucas was at the helm and made dumb choices in the prequels, nobody was there to suggest alternatives. They just assumed it was going to be great because it was Rian Johnson and he couldn't possibly screw it up, similar to how George was treated during the development of his prequels. That isn't to say that they can't produce good writing. Both of them have. Rian did it with Luke and Kylo, and George did it with everything that wasn't General Grievous in Revenge of the Sith. Hell, I go back and forth on whether or not it's my favorite Star Wars movie, despite the fact that it's a prequel. But nonetheless, you run the risk of dumb ideas making the final cut of a movie when a single person writes and directs an entire project. Case in point, you can't have one dude write an entire movie on his own and expect nothing bad to happen. And it's really funny because the sequel suffers from the exact opposite problem, where a committee wrote the movie and like the hack that wrote Dawn of Justice wrote it. So it's really a complicated issue, and I'm not really sure what the solution is. It's definitely not a boardroom, but it's also not writing it up in a log cabin in isolation. If you read and watch the behind-the-scenes documentary, it's very clear that Rian was a passionate director about what he was doing, as well as a passionate writer, and so is the entire cast and crew. He went up to a log cabin, locked himself away, and wrote the movie for a couple weeks, refusing to go into the public until it was something he was happy with. So much thought went into every visual frame of this movie, it oozes passion. We're not dealing with a Dan and David Benioff situation where they sort of forgot about giving a shit toward the end of Game of Thrones.
While Danny kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet.
The movie's not a train wreck. The issue here is that nobody really questioned Rian Johnson on any of the creative decisions he was making, and if they did, Rian wasn't willing to listen. The movie is bold, and yes, a lot of its choices don't land. But that's what filmmaking is. You take risks and you make choices, and not all of them are going to land. You just have to make your movie new. Even the creator of Star Wars himself believes this.
They wanted to do a retro movie. I don't like that. Every movie I worked very hard to make them different.
The Last Jedi was a provocative movie, and it oscillated between being astonishing and terrible, and ultimately, you're never going to get a group of people together in a room and have them agree on this film. However, I would argue that that's what art is. Art should make you feel something. It can be hate, it can be love, it can be sadness, and it can be joy. If an artist can pour his heart and soul into his work, who's to say that that work had no meaning? The fact that we're all members of a community that feels so passionately for these movies and the way they're made is a beautiful thing in and of itself, and despite its flaws, The Last Jedi is a work of art with so much meaningful philosophical contribution to the overall narrative. I guess I would say The Last Jedi isn't so different from the prequels. They were made from the heart, brilliant in story, and didn't quite always stick the landing, but did it ruin Star Wars? No. If we can learn to love the prequels despite being highly flawed films, who's to say you can't learn to love The Last Jedi for what it is as well? Anakin's immolation and fall will always be tragic. Luke's growth will always be relatable. Vader's turn will always be heartfelt. Han saving Luke is always going to inspire kids. And Ben Solo's torment will always be empathetic and sympathetic. The Last Jedi, it's not a perfect film, and to others it might not even be a good film. But I feel like it's the most artful and impassioned of all the sequel movies, and to me, that makes it great. Warts and all.